Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today, we're going to talk about this paper called Evidence from Finland and Sweden on the Relationship Between Early Life Diseases and Lifetime Childlessness in Men and Women. And so this paper is looking at basically what factors lead an individual to never have kids. And there's a lot of factors, but one of them is that they have diseases early on in their life. And by diseases, this paper, as we're going to see, they talk about everything ranging from serious birth defects to like mental health issues or like schizophrenia or mood disorders or alcoholism or things like that. Okay, now the reason this matters is because in Western societies, we have a relatively low fertility rate. And our low fertility rate is causing a lot of problems because it means there aren't enough new laborers being born to financially support the aging population. So as people become older, they become basically a financial drain on society. They move into nursing homes. We have to pay to house them there and to take care of them. And that money to pay for that comes from our taxes and from borrowing. And the taxes, of course, come from income taxes mostly, which comes from laborers. If you don't have enough laborers, you don't have enough government revenue to pay for the aging population. And so what happens then is the government looks for other sources of laborers. And so as we're seeing in the West, our leadership has decided to import the third world en masse into our countries to have cheap labor to basically keep our economies afloat in the midst of a fertility crisis. So we need to figure out what factors are leading to childlessness, and we need to address that because obviously we want to increase our fertility rate if we're going to stop the mass migration of third worlders into our countries, which, by the way, is demographically replacing the native population, and white people are going to be a minority in most white countries by the end of the century. So the idea is if we can figure out what's causing childlessness, we can address it. Now, the situation is even a little bit more bleak because early life diseases are increasing in frequency. So not only is our fertility declining, although it might be rebounding a little bit now, but disease frequencies are increasing for most chronic diseases. So as we're going to see, one of the main diseases that leads to childlessness is obesity. Well, obesity rates are skyrocketing. Another one is mental health disorders. Those are also skyrocketing. Okay, so we need to really improve our environment and our population's health if we're going to correct our fertility crisis, which is necessary to basically save our population from replacement. Okay, so now we're going to get into the paper. So they start off by giving some basic statistics on like how many people don't have kids. So they say there's been a sharp increase in childlessness over the past few decades in countries such as Finland. So, and this concept holds true for all Western countries, to my knowledge. They say increasing since the 1970s from 14 to 22% for women aged 40 years. Okay, so it used to be only 14% of women never had children. Now it's 22%. So more than a fifth of women never have children. And for men, it used to be around 22% in the 1970s, whereas now it's around 32%. Okay, so almost 1 out of 3 men doesn't have children and will never have children. So again, that's a serious fertility crisis. They go on to look at the factors that are contributing to this. They say here, and this is the big one, access to effective contraception at the end of the 1960s in many countries, and more recently, emergency postcoital contraception, so that's like the morning after pill, in the late 1990s, provided couples with greater ability to control their reproduction. And I would add contraceptive abortion to that list. They say then so basically contraceptives is one of the main reasons the fertility rate dropped, because oftentimes people don't want kids, especially as we're going to see in a harsh economy, which we have. And so then if they have the mechanism, the technology to prevent themselves from having kids, they will. Another factor they talk about is they say women's opportunities also vastly changed in many industrialized nations since the 1980s, with gains in higher levels of education and entry into the labor market accompanied by shifts in gender norms and equity. So to translate that, they're putting it diplomatically, but they're basically saying that feminism is causing women to abandon their family role and enter the labor market, and in doing so, that's causing the fertility to plummet. So a lot more people are going throughout their lives childless than ever before. So then they say economic uncertainty is another factor, Because, of course, if you can't afford a kid, if you're a responsible person, you're not going to have a kid that you can't take care of. Okay. And so as our economic situation worsens, there are going to be even fewer children being born. So there's like a positive feedback cycle there. As our fertility rate declines, our economic situation worsens because we have to tax the population more to pay for the elderly. But then as we have to tax them more, the economic situation for people gets worse, which means they're even less likely to have kids, which means the population declines further, which means you need to tax them even more to support the aging population. And then you have a self-amplifying cycle of destruction, essentially. So bad economy leads to lower fertility rates. They say inability to find a partner. I think this is another big one. So, evidence for that comes from like the high divorce rates. Men and women aren't getting along in our society. I think that's obvious. There's a massive and growing political divide and broader ideological divide. Women are disgusted by men. Men are disgusted by women. I think there's a lot more gender conflict than probably ever before in our society. So, they're not able to find a compatible partner. And they're certainly not able to stick together as much as they used to be able to. All right. Another one is job strain. We kind of already talked about that. So as women enter the workforce, they're trying to balance both a job and a family. Well, oftentimes they prioritize the job. And so that means they don't have children, or at least not as many children. And so they say job strain has been found to reduce fertility intentions. So people don't want to have kids if they're too worried about their job. And then they say afterwards that basically the job market is more flexible than it used to be. So people are, starting one job, quitting or getting fired or being let go, or the job is always meant to be temporary, and then they're starting a new job. And so there's a lot more jumping around, and there's a lot more moving around like geographically. So you might go to college in one place and then go to graduate school in another location, and then find a job at another location, and then have to move again in a couple of years. So it's really hard to plant your roots in today's society in a given area. And this also makes it difficult to start a family because you don't want to be, moving your kids around from school to school. That's not good for their social development. So all of these factors are making it difficult for people to have kids. They also say key predictors for male childlessness are the rise of multiple and short partnerships and a normative shift to a growing group of men who are uninterested in becoming fathers. Okay, so what they're saying here is basically we're no longer monogamous. It's no longer the case that a man, courts a woman that he likes and then marries her and then stays with her forever. Instead, we live in hookup culture and a very promiscuous society where both men and women have many sexual partners, typically, before they get married. And this makes it more difficult for them to have children. In other words, it ruins their interest in having children. And the reason for that is if you have children, you're kind of tied down, so to speak. You're basically tied to your partner that you had the child with. Whereas if you don't have any kids, you can continue to live the promiscuous lifestyle. So, and this is true for both. They say it for males, but it's also true for females. Okay. Females are very promiscuous in today's society, and they understand that if they have a kid, that automatically reduces male interest in them. Okay. So neither men nor women really want children for this reason. They don't want it to stop them from being able to be promiscuous. So as a side note, this is just another argument in favor of monogamy, okay, and sexual restraint. You should not be having sex with everybody you can, everybody you meet. You should be looking for a single partner that you love, and you should be waiting until marriage, ideally, to have sex with that person. All right, then they say lastly, others have linked rises in male childlessness to lifestyle factors, such as becoming more sedentary, alcoholism, tobacco use, and poor diet. And again, I don't know why they single out males here. This is also true for women. Okay. Their higher obesity rates. They're also have a worse lifestyle, poorer diet, and that's also impacting their fertility rates. So, and this is definitely true. The reproductive organs are basically being destroyed by endocrine disruptors in the environment and by poor lifestyle decisions. So all of these factors are contributing to reduced fertility among both men and women. Okay, so here they say something I found interesting, which is that the percentage of individuals who report that they never intend to have children has remained low and is estimated to be about 5% in Europe. I would have thought it'd be higher. So they're saying basically these are the people who don't want kids. I would have imagined it'd be higher than 5%, but they say it's only about 5% of people just don't want kids. So it's most of the childlessness is not voluntary childlessness, it's involuntary childlessness. Now, what are the consequences of childlessness? They say here, and maybe we'll do a whole video on this topic in the future, but they say childless men and women are more likely to suffer from relationship dissolution, lower levels of self-esteem and isolation, and higher risks of clinical depression. A recent systemic review found that infertile women, particularly those in middle and low-income countries, are more likely to experience psychological, physical, and sexual violence, as well as economic coercion. And for childless men, their workplace interactions and career opportunities have been found to be negatively affected. So in other words, people who don't have children, they're more likely to have a variety of problems, both like psychological problems, self-esteem problems, depression, and according to this study at least, even victims of violence and limited career opportunities. Okay, so in addition to the broader societal consequences of low fertility, which is, as everything I mentioned before, causing a labor deficit and all that, there's also like individual level consequences for not having children. So generally speaking, it's good to have children. Okay, so now they get into sort of the topic of this paper, which is how diseases might impact the risk of being childless. So in other words, there's all those factors we mentioned above, but it's also the case that people who have disease, and we're going to see many different types of diseases, they're more likely to be childless. And the reasons are as follows. They say, first, diseases may directly influence childlessness through medical conditions that affect fecundity. So basically, like if a disease impacts the reproductive organs and prevents them from functioning properly, that disease obviously contributes to childlessness. They say, second, diseases can impact selection into a partnership, which in turn lowers the chance of being partnered and thus having children. So in other words, the person has a disease and that makes them unappealing to the opposite sex. And so they can't find a partner and therefore they can't have children. And then they say, third, some may choose to be child-free due to knowledge or concerns of intergenerational transmission of certain known genetic conditions. So, in other words, they know they have a genetic disease. They don't want to pass that on to their child, so they choose not to have a child. Okay? So those are the main potential ways that disease is linked to childlessness. Okay, so one interesting concept is that childlessness might actually be beneficial to society in these specific cases. So I know I just described all the benefits of having children, but for certain individuals, it might be better off for them not to have children. So, we don't want necessarily them passing on all their diseases to their offspring and thus perpetuating these diseases in society. So if there's like a disease-linked childlessness, that might serve a eugenic function, which would ultimately improve the health of the population at the next point in time. Okay, so now we're going to get into this paper and their methods and results. So we're going to skip this first figure. This is just a schematic showing the breakdown of their method, but I think it's more confusing than just to explain it. So what they did is they just had a very large data sample with over 1 million women and over 1 million men. And this is in Finland and Sweden. And they basically looked to see their childlessness rates and their disease rates. And then the only complex part is really that they compared as like a control. They compared each person to their siblings who did have children. Okay, that's sort of a control. Really doesn't matter that much. Basically, all you need to know is they followed a bunch of women and a bunch of men. They collected data on them, whether or not they had children and whether or not they had different diseases, to see if any specific diseases were associated with childlessness in these people. All right, so now we're going to get directly into the results. So here they say that some of the diseases, 11 rare diseases, were associated with an almost complete lack of children. So, for example, they say here, people with like muscular dystrophy. So muscular dystrophy, that happens in males, and it basically, causes their muscles to waste away, and they rarely survive past their 20s. Okay, so they say certain rare diseases basically led to a complete lack of children, which is to be expected. Another one is severe intellectual disability. Okay, so if somebody's like mentally retarded, then it's going to be more difficult for them to find a partner and reproduce. So they basically excluded all of those from future analyses. They say of the remaining 403 diseases, 74 were significantly associated with childlessness in at least one sex. And we're going to look at those next. Okay, so as a preview, they say more than half of the significant associations were mental behavioral disorders. So in other words, of all the diseases that were associated with childlessness, about half of the diseases were related to mental disorders. So again, this suggests that childlessness in this context is having a eugenic function for society, because basically mentally disturbed and behaviorally abnormal people were not able to breed, presumably because they weren't able to find a partner. Okay, if somebody has schizophrenia, they're going to have a real tough time finding a partner who's going to put up with that long enough to marry and reproduce with them. And as a side note, it's important to say that another negative consequence of promiscuity culture is women are getting impregnated by men that they really don't know very well. And so, for example, they might go to a party, they might hook up with somebody once and get impregnated by them. They don't have the opportunity to vet that person that they're reproducing with to see if they have a mental health disorder. Okay? And so this is a way that people with like schizophrenia or serious mood disorders can sort of slip through the cracks and reproduce, okay? Because they don't have to go through the mate vetting that used to be required in a monogamous society. If we were all monogamous, people aren't going to choose to spend their entire life with a partner who has schizophrenia, generally speaking. Okay? And so that would select against schizophrenia. However, in the context of a hypergamous society where people are reproducing with everybody or having sex with all kinds of different people, all right, people with serious disorders are going to slip through the cracks. They're going to get their rare opportunity to reproduce, and those disorders are going to amplify in the next generation. So in that way, promiscuity is sort of dysgenic. It promotes unhealthy genotypes in the next generation. Okay, but that's sort of a side note. So we're just going to go straight to their main figure. So this is showing figure 2. What it's showing is on the y-axis, this is the odds of being childless by age 45, and this first panel is in women. And then across the x-axis, this is showing different diseases, different categories of diseases. And then each little diamond or triangle in this graph is a different disease. So for example, women who had mild intellectual disability, this triangle right here, okay, they were much more likely to be childless by age 45. They were 15 times more likely than the normal person to be childless by age 45. Likewise, women who had schizophrenia were about 12 times more likely to end up childless. And then you can see all kinds of other diseases. So these orange ones, these are all like the mental health diseases or the psychological diseases. You also have like type 2 diabetes over here. We'll talk about it later, but obesity is in here. Even things like heart disease, myocarditis, that contributes to childlessness. And then congenital malformations of the circulatory system. So this is basically like birth defects. Okay. So all of these are examples of diseases that if you have this, you're more likely to go about being childless. And again, I want to stress that in this case, the childlessness is serving sort of a eugenic function, because all of these diseases are going to become less common in the population at the next generation because they're not reproducing. All right, so next they show the same thing but for men, and the results are basically the same. So again, mild intellectual disability was the highest. So men who had a mild intellectual disability, they were about 20 times more likely to be childless by age 50. Likewise, schizophrenia is another big one, alcohol dependence, more congenital malformations, mood disorders, obesity. A lot of different diseases contributed to childlessness in men also. All right, and then we're going to ignore the right panel here. That's just basically a summary of this, a simplified version of this. We don't need to look at that. Okay, next they provided evidence that the reason for this, the reason that these diseases are causing childlessness, is because they're preventing the people from finding a partner. Okay, so if a woman has schizophrenia, she's not going to be able to find a partner as well as if she didn't have schizophrenia, and therefore she can't reproduce. Okay, we're not going to get too detailed on that, but they found that being single was a major mediating factor, and it was more pronounced for men. So the reason that men with these diseases aren't reproducing is because they can't find a partner. And to a lesser extent, that's also true for women, but we don't really need to dwell on that. Okay. All right. So for the next figure, what it's showing in the first panel is on the y-axis, this is the odds of being childless for men. And on the x-axis, this is the odds of being childless for women. And so what they're looking at here is for a given disease, does it inhibit male fertility or female fertility more? And so if the triangle is above this faint dotted line that you can barely see, then it affects men more. If the disease is below that dotted line, then it affects women more. That's how you interpret this. So for example, schizophrenia, even though it's like far up on the y-axis and far over on the x-axis, so it inhibits both male and female fertility, it inhibits male fertility more. Okay, so does obsessive compulsive disorder, so does alcohol intoxication. Interestingly, so does myopia. That's basically short-sightedness. If you look at women, congenital abnormalities of the digestive system. Okay, so some sort of digestive issue, like inflammatory bowel disease or heart disease. Those are more inhibitory for female fertility. And they also look at the age at which the disease begins and its effect on the risk of being childless. So they've averaged all the diseases and the age at which it began for that individual. And they looked at the odds of being childless for those individuals. So for example, if the disease was beginning in that individual when that individual was 21 to 25 years old, that was the period where it most inhibited their fertility because it's the highest point on this curve. Okay, women are the solid line, men are the dotted line, but they follow a similar trend, except men are offset a little bit. They're delayed a little bit. Okay. For another example, if the disease began late in life, so like when the woman or the man was 41 to 45, it really didn't affect the risk of being childless that much. And that's because, their fertile years have already passed. So how could the disease affect it retroactively? Okay. So they show that for all the diseases combined, and then they separate the different diseases a little bit. So what's interesting to me here is if you look at obesity, if that one is onset early, so like 15 or like late teenage years, that's when it has the biggest consequence for fertility. Okay, so we really need to tackle childhood obesity. But that's really the main interesting thing from this figure. Okay, and that's pretty much the last figure. There's a lot of additional figures in their supplemental information online, but we're not going to go through all of that. The main point is simply that, people who have diseases are more likely to never reproduce and go throughout their lives childless. And a lot of that is because they aren't able to find a partner. Okay. Another portion of that is because they realize that they have a disease that discourages them from wanting to reproduce. Okay. But ultimately, it might be an adaptive mechanism if these people aren't able to find a partner or reproduce, because it would limit the frequency of these diseases at the next point in time. Okay. But an important point on that is that most of these diseases are environmental, not genetic. So even though these people aren't reproducing their diseased phenotype by having children, if our environment continues to be unhealthy, then these diseases are just going to keep popping up in other people, regardless of whether they inherited it from their parents, because it's environmental more so than genetic. Okay, so we really need to improve our environment, improve our lifestyle if we're going to tackle the fertility crisis. And again, we need to tackle the fertility crisis in order to boost our population size, which is needed to boost the labor pool, which is needed to basically support the aging population, which is necessary to keep our economy afloat. Okay, in the absence of that, our leadership has proven they're going to import laborers that will replace us. Okay, because they care most about the economy and making a profit. So this is one of the steps we need to take if we're going to save our civilization. Thanks for listening.